Hey, Brainiacs, it's Dwight, your host, best buddy, psychotherapist, and all-around host, once again, for the show. Coming back at you with the broken brain. This is a replay of an episode from a couple years back where I interviewed Dr. Rebecca Dempster about trauma and resilience and how to measure that, increase it, and basically how to survive through some tough times. The reason I'm sharing this again is on my recent episode with Dr. Susan Trachman, we mentioned this very episode talking about resilience and how different people have different vulnerabilities or different resilience strengths, basically, against trauma. Dr. Dempster works primarily with NGOs and those that volunteer in third world nations and in some places where there's a lot of danger and just where there's a lot of sorrow as well. And so burnout, trauma, even PTSD upon occasion, obviously, and just other things that factor into that, and the importance of knowing who we are, knowing how we take trauma, and making a good team approach for how we do that. So I thought I would share that again. The other episode that you might want to check out, which is much more recent, so I'm not going to replay it yet, is Dr. Tammy Chang. If you go back in the podcast feed, you'll be able to find that one. And that was an excellent discussion about medical providers and burnout and doctors and great things too. So three wonderful doctors, one psychologist, and two MDs prompted this. So enjoy this broken brain replay now of Dr. Rebecca Dempster talking about resilience and trauma.
So let's start by being traumatic. How did you get focused on trauma in your career? Was that something you always wanted to do, or did that just happen?
It kind of just happened. I mean, my initial interest in psychology was in forensic psychology. And when I went to graduate school, I did a specialization in forensics, but I also had always this interest in working with really vulnerable people and in working with, in the humanitarian sector was kind of in the back of my mind. Then when I did my internship for graduate school, I had a forensic internship, but the other half had to be filled. And it was, I did it at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. And it was just by chance that I was assigned to do a rotation in dialectical behavior therapy. So with people with borderline personality disorder, many of whom had quite extreme trauma histories. And maybe somewhat unusually, I loved it. I just really found it incredibly satisfying and meaningful work. And so for a number of years, I worked with both forensic patients and forensic clients, and then also with the other side, doing this dialectical behavior therapy with trauma survivors.
I understand that. That's a big enjoyment thing of mine. I like working with personality disorders. And I always say it's kind of one of the biases that lives within our field a lot of times. I've heard therapists when I was coming up before I worked in mental health for a long time before I went to grad school, and I didn't know what borderline meant other than it was the thing therapists said when they didn't want to work with people.
Exactly. No. And when I was told, like, this is what you're going to be doing for the other half of your time on internship, I was filled with dread because all I had heard was like, they're terrible, manipulative, it will be awful. And that wasn't my experience at all. And I really enjoyed it. And then the other part of it was that I'm Canadian, but I grew up overseas. So that was always kind of part of who I was. And I had a strong desire to work internationally again. And then I guess made the opportunity and did a 6-month consultancy with the UN Refugee Agency. And that was the start of it.
That's something that's really interesting in your biography. I think a lot of people just crank through school and go, oh, well, I guess I'll just work wherever you tell me to work. And here on the show, we often talk about the different things where therapy and mental health can be helpful, should be helpful. And one thing that struck me about your experience is you kind of went out and said, oh, there's a need for this on the international scene and the humanitarian work. That, at least from my experience, is not something that someone comes along and says, hey, answer this ad in the paper and just go work in humanitarian work as a social worker or as a therapist. So you say you had to kind of look for that and make that happen.
Yeah, I really started to think more and more, I'd like to try it. I'd like at least to see, even if I was going to do what some people do, which is kind of have a practice at home and then occasionally go out. And so I made a couple of forays and trying, and I don't speak French. And so, the MSF said to me, no, you have to be able to speak French. I know I don't speak French and I don't know how to ice skate. I'm going to take away my citizenship. But
you like maple syrup, right?
Yes, of course.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
good. All right.
Yeah. So eventually I found this opportunity and I was seconded from a Canadian NGO to the UN Refugee Agency in Kenya in the aftermath of post-election violence in Kenya. And so it was the first chance for me to see how would my skill set fit here? Does this make sense? And it was a really interesting experience. And then I haven't moved back home since then, much to my family's great disappointment.
Well, that's cool. And so you encountered some trauma in that environment?
For sure. Yeah.
That's my
just
stupid question for the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so with that, you're going into those basically just very war-torn, very traumatic environments where there's almost a societal trauma as well as individuals that you run into. Yeah. Yeah,
there's really, I think, a collective trauma there. And one of the areas that I'm working in a lot now as well is, so you have the trauma in the environment, and people's personal and familial trauma is complicated by the fact that the entire community is going through this. So what we might have to kind of help support us get through these things has been disintegrated. But then you also have what I wasn't expecting so much and really now see is a huge issue is trauma in the people who are providing service, in the aid workers and humanitarian workers. And it's a hugely stressful occupation for people. So yeah, there's a little bit of need for mental health services there.
And I want to talk about that secondary trauma kind of dynamic as well. I was going to ask you, though, did you find as you're going in as at least I'm assuming, I don't think you said where you went to school, but Western trained, in the U.S. or Canada, you can plug your school if you want, but if you don't like them, don't plug them.
Okay.
But
it was Simon Fraser.
There you go. See, I didn't realize I just inadvertently set up a pressure there. Your professor's sitting there listening. They were big fans. Exactly. Big friend of the show. When you were going into those environments, I wanted to ask about this. Did you find trouble bringing our styles of therapy into some of those? I know Andrew Solomon, who's a writer on depression, he did a big thing where he talked about some of the rural African treatments that they did with shamans and things, and they had the whole village support. And I remember he mentioned that they told him that all these relief workers come in and we don't know how to relate to them because they want to take us in rooms and talk about our feelings, and that's not what we do here.
Yeah. That is a big part of this work, is really needing to develop respect and a cultural competency and thinking. It's been really interesting for me professionally just to start to think about intervention as so much more than therapy. There's a really great book. I don't know if you've read this one called Crazy Like Us by Ethan Waters.
I haven't. I like the name.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's about exactly this topic. It's about the export or the globalization of Western mental health concepts and treatment. And so in each chapter, he looks at a different disorder. And one of them is actually in the aid industry, looking at the response to the tsunami in 2004. But I've really evolved in the almost 7 years now that I've been doing this, and really understanding that recovery from trauma is not only achieved through therapy. And I was saying this to some people I was doing a training yesterday. We often, because it's a Western approach, the way the whole system has been designed, when a lot of people are interviewing trauma survivors in the context of refugee work, they'll ask them, did you get counseling? Would you like to see a counselor? And what I was saying is it's really a problem that we're not asking people, how did you cope with this? Because that suggests that the avenue to wellness is through counseling. And it isn't. For many, many people, it isn't. It's one. And I think therapy is great. I enjoy doing therapy. Big fan. Think it can be really effective, but it's part of.
We heard it here first, everyone. Rebecca's coming out against therapy. No. Well, although I actually, spoiler alert, I agree with what you're saying. I think what you're saying is true even in therapy. When people come seeking therapy and we have cultural, that cultural common ground to build upon. I'm a big believer in aspects of solution-focused therapy. One of which is to treat the client as the expert. That they're the expert of their own problem, their own solutions, their own feelings and everything. And I always give them that little intro about, hey, I need you to be an expert. I only have my own expertise. I want you to have yours. I'm not the only expert in here talking about stuff. And one of the things I like to ask is just what you said. You've been through some trauma. How have you coped so far? And not just, oh, you haven't coped and now you're going to start to cope because Mr. Therapist is here to help.
Yes.
And I just think that's too dehumanizing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say it's something that the field there's a lot of recognition of it, I would say, but not a lot of action on it. We still have a tendency to look at psychosocial interventions as being counseling.
We all kind of want to be Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting, where I'm going to say this one cool thing, and then you're going to burst into tears, and it's going to be great. And so you talk about like kind of broadening the scope of recovery to a more, talk about what it is, more community-based, more influencing in different ways outside of just the therapy office.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been some interesting studies looking at it. So one that stands out for me, looking at something like the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder in different cultures. And what I would say is can you find it across the world? Yes, but you're always missing something. If that's what you're looking for, you're always missing. Even again, in a Western culture, there's a multitude of ways that people can be affected by trauma. And that's one very specific way, but we know that people have problems with depression, with anxiety, all sorts of other things. And here I'm not talking about people who are resilient necessarily, but if you take that more broadly, some of the comparative studies have really shown that not only do people express their distress in very culturally specific ways, but the manner in which they choose to cope with it is culturally specific. So I think there needs to be more involvement of religious community and the support that people draw from that, from spiritual leaders, from community, looking especially where you're working with somebody whose concept of themselves is not as an individual, but part of a system, and whether that system is the family or the community, and where you have so many people affected at the same time. So there's really, I think, a lot of room for looking more creatively at these things.
And I remember years ago I was sitting in a training about trauma debriefing following major events and things like that. And one of the things I thought was very interesting was the trainer, and this is the first time I had ever come across this idea that there are different responses. And that sounds stupid, but here I had been through like graduate level courses on mental health and psychology. And the first time he said, oh, they're doing studies that indicate that some people don't improve from just talking about their feelings. You can tell basically based off of if they have other aberrant, if they're refusing to talk about their feelings and they're drinking themselves to sleep every night, there's probably a problem. But if they're refusing to talk about their feelings and they're flourishing and thriving psychologically, why would we force them to talk about their feelings? They have a different coping response. Right. And I was like, oh, I mean, that seems so stupid and simple when you say it out loud and say, oh, people are different. But we don't like to look at it that way sometimes. We want everyone to fit in our box. Exactly.
And I really think, I don't know where you went to school and if you want to plug that as well, but in my training, there wasn't a lot of focus on resilience and strength. It really was, the class was called abnormal psychology, not thriving and flourishing. And so that idea also was new to me at some point that, some people actually are truly okay. And even I come across that. When I was working as a staff welfare officer for one of the UN agencies, I had a couple of people referred to me who had been through a traumatic incident, and they had seen already a different counselor. And she said to me about one of them, he says he's fine, but I don't know if it's denial. And I thought, how limiting that we can't just believe that this person is fine. And I had another, somebody I knew was taken hostage thankfully, very briefly. And when he was released, his wife was telling me, he says he's fine and no one will believe him. And it's starting to make him kind of question whether he really is okay.
Maybe I shouldn't be fine.
Is there something wrong with me that I don't feel traumatized? So I think it's really important. It's something I talk a lot about in training, is recognizing that there's no single way that people are affected, and that we can see resilience. We can see people recovering on their own. And we also see people who are profoundly struggling with what happened to them.
So you talk a little bit, if you would, about resiliency. I think it's important to kind of define that. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that idea of what is resiliency, what does it mean to have high resiliency, low resiliency, that type of thing.
For me, the way I think about resilience is that it is an ability to cope with adversity and to either maintain your well-being in the face of adversity, or to bounce back quickly and without the need of professional intervention. So either you just kind of, you're okay. And even though things are really difficult, and even though things are really stressful, or you're maybe not okay while it's happening, but you get there on your own.
Kind of like, I often talk about the difference between, we throw out PTSD all the time. And it's one of those things I hear people say, I got some PTSD, whatever. And I always say, we got to remember what the D stands for. The D is when it gets to a point of being a disorder. Everybody who goes through T for trauma has PTS. We all have post-traumatic stress or traumatic stress. And sometimes we misuse that. If we're working with someone, I work with a lot of domestic violence situations where they're not really necessarily going through post-trauma. They're in trauma. And that's going to cause those kinds of symptoms and stress in the short term. So even if someone is experiencing, I just had a horrific car accident, I just had this abuse happen, I just had this crime perpetrated against me, I'm not necessarily to the disordered stage just because a week or two later I'm having the shakes.
Right. And interestingly, one study that I remember reading about resilience said that one of the things that resilient people do in the face of trauma is to see their reactions, the PTS part, as normal and temporary. So when they feel overwhelmed, sad, when they have a nightmare, their attention is off, they just look at it and say, yeah, of course. Like, that's a completely natural reaction to what I just went through, and I'll be okay. And so it is very much not that resilient people don't feel anything or it didn't bother them. And I cannot remember who said this, but it's a quote you come across a lot in the trauma research, which is, no one who goes through a traumatic experience is untouched by it. But it's varying degrees of being touched.
I'm just going to put on the website and cite you. Let's see. Rebecca said that statement. Let's give it to you now.
Okay.
Just kind of like that Mandela quote that goes around. That's not really a Mandela quote because he used it in a speech. Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
No. And so I think for kind of what ties in with what we're talking about is sometimes there's a misconception of resilience as equaling strength or moral fortitude. I think we see that a lot in law enforcement or military. There's a strong stigma. If you happen to have low resilience, that's more of a psychological or medical health statement. I'm having low resilience, so I need some help, instead of saying, oh, I'm a weak person.
Yes. And I would say that is also prevalent in the humanitarian sector. The idea that if you're affected, so you can quote me on this one because I did say this. So if no one is who goes through trauma is unaffected by it, no one who repeatedly is exposed to other people's trauma is unaffected by that. That is my quote.
That is good. Yes. Wait, say it again so we can highlight it.
No one who's repeatedly exposed to other people's trauma is unaffected by that experience.
And that brings up that secondary trauma. I don't know if you like that term, but that's what they call that a lot of times in our field.
Yeah. I mean, you hear vicarious trauma, secondary trauma. I use them kind of interchangeably, even though I'm not sure that they are interchangeable. But yeah, just to go back to that, in the humanitarian sector, there is this really unhealthy culture of, if you are affected, you are not cut out for this work. You're weak. You shouldn't be doing it.
I've seen that play out in, for example, I used to work in inpatient treatment a lot, and you'd get people who would almost try to out cynical each other. Like, oh, well, that patient's they're going to kill themselves. One of these days they're going to kill themselves. I just know they are. Whoa, you said that about everybody who's come in here. It's like you're hedging your bets. You don't want to be wrong about someone. Heaven forbid you want to say, hey, they're really serious about their recovery.
Yes.
And everyone's like, oh, sure, you're just naive. We're all trying to out hard ass each other.
And this is one of the things that I think about resilience also is it's fluid, right? It's like your physical immune system as well. Sometimes you're susceptible to cold, sometimes you're not. When you're susceptible to a cold, that's not a weakness. It's just a fact of life that these kinds of things go up and down. I think mental resilience is the same.
Yeah, we still have this stigma attached to that, even as professionals many times. What kinds of things did you start to see? You mentioned that was a surprise for you to start to see how powerful that type of trauma that humanitarian workers and those fellow professionals were having.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there were two surprises. The one surprise was the organizational culture, right? Which I very naively thought would be more sort of warm and fuzzy, was much more sort of be tough, don't talk about these things. And to varying degrees, I think right now there is an increasing recognition, and it feels like the conversation on this is building, and people are starting to see that this is not because these people are not cut out or that they're weak. This is just the nature of this kind of work. But I think I don't know if you're familiar with the defense cascade. If you've seen this idea that when we're exposed to trauma directly, we can go through, rather than just stopping at fight or flight, which is what most of us are familiar with, that there's this concept of tonic immobility where people can, when they're frightened, go into paralysis. And then if the kind of trauma is unrelenting, there's no escape, people will shut down. So there's the huge increase in energy, and then there's the shutdown. And for me, I see that in secondary trauma. They're the people who are kind of in the uproar side who are, extremely emotionally reactive. They're having a hard time with intrusive thoughts. They feel unsafe all of the time. They have nightmares, those kinds of things. And then the other side, which I would say in secondary trauma, is where people shut down. Right. And they shut down by becoming cynical and jaded and disconnected from the people that they work with. And I think that was also really surprising to kind of see those things happening.
And so then seeing that, there's a tendency to just attribute that strictly behaviorally. Oh, you're just cynical. You're just jaded. Oh, no, those are symptoms of trauma.
Yeah. It's a protective mechanism, right? Because if you hear the worst things that people can do to each other day in and day out, at some point, for some people, it's just too much. And it's like, if I don't believe these people anymore, then I don't have to accept the fact that the world really is that there's that much awfulness in the world.
And so you saw that essentially, I'm going to call it almost misdiagnosis, administrative misdiagnosis, because people are saying, oh, that person, get rid of them. They're not cut out for the field. Oh, that person, get rid of them. Instead of saying, oh, that person is succumbing to some trauma. Let's work on that.
Yeah. And in that sector, I wouldn't say that it's not really get rid of them, but it's just sort of leave them alone, right? And don't support them and
marginalize them.
Yeah. And certainly, I don't mean to suggest that it's all bad and that there's no support for people, but it's also an industry where it's really hard to bring people what they need because they're spread all over the world. They're often in very remote places where you can't have, all the kinds of supports that you would like to have in place in every place that humanitarians are posted. But there is this a more alarming side of an organizational culture, which is just like, let's not talk about these things. Or at one time, somebody asked me about selecting. Should we create a selection process where we're looking for people who are resilient? And my response was, first of all, if you look at resilience to trauma, one, not the only, but one of the factors that predicts resilience is narcissism. Do you want an office full of people who are high on narcissism? Fantastic if something goes really wrong, but maybe not that much fun all of the time. So you'd over-select for that.
Plus
And
the embezzlement and all of the office problems that would
Really.
start to happen.
yeah. And then the other piece is there is something that people who are less resilient bring to the table that we would lose if we didn't have them, if we only selected people who are really, really hardy, we'll miss out on the things that people who are less hardy have to offer. And in a field like humanitarian work, I think that would be a huge loss.
What are some things that you see that tie with that? Maybe strengths, if you want to call them that.
I think empathy is a big one, right? The capacity to really empathize with people, to be very, very compassionate. And it is a risk factor for secondary trauma. The ability to really visualize, to care deeply about other people. And I don't mean to suggest that resilient people are like uncaring and cold, and that's not it at all. But if you only selected a certain kind of people, you'd miss out on some of that.
Yeah, there is a difference. You need the person to say, okay, here's where we make administrative decisions, and here's where we direct this, and the other person to say, wait a minute,
Yeah.
and whatever. You really need both those people in humanitarian work, as well as any kind of healthcare. Really.
Any kind of,
Yeah. Well, I know it's a really powerful observation. So when you started to see that happen, what sort of clued you in to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, this is trauma, guys. What's going on here?
I think it was just coming from a mental health background, which is a different background than many people in this area. And especially I was working a lot with the UN Refugee Agency, and a lot of them come from a legal background. So I was sort of the fish out of water of thinking about these things differently. And I had come from a really strong experience in the clinic that I worked in, the dialectical behavior therapy one. It was a fantastic team, and I had this amazing mentor, Shelley McMain, who's just an all-around fantastic human being, amazing psychologist, and a wonderful, wonderful mentor who really modeled that it's okay to be vulnerable, and that it's okay to find this work difficult. And the idea is not never find things difficult, but get help when you do.
Yeah, and that's a real staple of DBT, too. If you're doing it correctly, you're supposed to even have little sort of DBT self-care groups with the therapists who are working with that
and
treatment
we
team.
did. We had 2 hours every week of our team meeting that was about how are we coping, and what do we need in order to be effective in this work. So that was also really surprising to me, that when I first started in the humanitarian sector, I discovered that no one there, very few people there, had received any kind of training on what trauma does. So what trauma does to people who directly experience it, and what trauma does to people who listen to it. It was just not something that people had an opportunity to hear about. And I couldn't believe that but you work almost exclusively with trauma survivors. It seems like it might be helpful to, understand this at some level. And so I think I kind of recognized it right away, that this is what's happening, and have been involved in different capacities since then, and trying to push for more training on these things and more support for people.
Well, I think you bring up something else that's really, really useful, which is this concept of the cure for this problem is not to eliminate the problem. It's not to say, let's make sure we pick better, hardier, whatever. Mm-hmm. Let's make sure that we never have risk factors. Let's make sure that this never happens. So what kind of things do you advise to protect from that secondary trauma, since avoidance is an unhealthy coping skill?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things that need to be happening. One are the organizations need to do a better job in supporting staff, and need to be, and that's hard. I recognize the challenges, as I said, that they had. It's really hard to do it when you have, 8,000 staff members, a huge rotation, turnover, people going here and there. And there are definitely challenges, but that's why I have started my website, because I think we could harness a lot of power from the internet and make this more available. So I think organizations need to look at how do we support people, and how do we reduce some of these unnecessary stressors. We cannot take away the trauma exposure part, because that is the work, but can we do a better job of, streamlining hiring practices and renewal of contracts, and just remove sort of bureaucratic stressors that add to the burden that people are already dealing with.
It's interesting as you talk about that, when one of the studies that I think is really fascinating I came across recently was studies where they looked at stress levels amongst veterans, and they compared stress levels on the battlefield to stress level when they're dealing with red tape with the VA when they come back home and they have to go through these bureaucratic hoops to get health care, to get whatever. Yeah. And they found that in many instances, the stress they were suffering was higher in the bureaucracy at home during peacetime for them than it was being shot at.
Really? I'd love to see that study. Yeah. Because it sort of maps onto what I see in humanitarians. It's like when you go into that, you're signing up to help vulnerable people and you kind of know that's going to be tough, but that's why I'm really here. But what I'm not here for is the red tape.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot that could be done there.
And that's one of those really, I think that's a brilliant insight, because that's one of those secondary things that people wouldn't think of a lot of times, to say, oh, let's make sure to reduce this level of stress. They would usually just look at the trauma itself only.
Yeah. Yeah. And then individually, I think there's a lot that people can do. The research on resilience shows that this is not an, sort of hardwired trait. I mean, I think some people are naturally more resilient, and part of that might be their innate level of emotional reactivity, but it's also a lot about how you were raised and the kinds of messages that you had and how your parents or your caregivers coped with stress. So the way I put it is resilience is a habit. Cool. It's fundamentally a habit, right? It's about thinking and behaving in ways that help you cope with stress. So one of the things that I've been looking at is what are the kind of thought
resiliency
patterns,
behaviors and thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there are a number of things that people can do that really help to create a bit of a buffer between the stressor and their reaction to it. And there's also a new, not necessarily new, but kind of a model out that suggests that resilience, how people cope with stress, is really largely a function of what they tell themselves about stress.
It kind of goes back to some of there's a therapy thing, the whole self-talk, self-dialogue, the whole cognitions, and do we just allow the automatic thoughts, or do we challenge them?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's very powerful, I love studies when they study about attribution and why we think things happen and why we think we do things. And it's amazing how powerful it is when someone, I just within the last 24 hours in this very office, someone was sitting here talking, and as he was talking, it wasn't even me, he just was talking, and he said that, this thing had happened where he had an altercation with a loved one, an argument. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of talking about it, he said, although, you know what? I handled it much better this time. And he was able to recognize that, oh no, this isn't just the same thing. I'm actually making some progress and changing, even though something undesirable happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think the resilience stuff is really clear. You'll never have a stress-free life, right? It's just, I don't know what that would look like. I cannot conceive of a life that doesn't have some kind of stress. So it really is about how you respond to it. And there's a parallel there with trauma as well, right? Because one of the predictors of well-being after trauma is the kind of emotions and thoughts that people had while this kind of incident was going on. So my work now is really looking at how do we give people the tools to build their own resilience, and what are the kinds of patterns that people could work on.
Yeah. So here's a thought about that. As you're talking about that, if somebody has someone in their life, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a spouse, someone who's exhibiting and who's showing some signs of this trauma, has been through something. I'm thinking of a lot of our listeners who maybe are in the military or married to someone in the military, and they're seeing somebody who's starting to have this. What's the most helpful thing the non-traumatized person can do to support and kind of reach out, do you think? What kinds of things should they keep in mind as they're approaching someone?
I think there's a few that come to mind. The first one would just be there, right? Just be available and be, not constantly, I mean like 24/7 you have to, but make sure that it's not reaching out once, because if you think about your own experiences at times when you've gone through something that's difficult, sometimes you're wanting to talk about it and sometimes you're not. So it's just this idea of, really reaching out on a continual basis so that it's much easier for somebody to say, yeah, I do want to talk about it now, than if you say, hey, I'm here whenever you want. And then 3 weeks later is when they're ready, but they don't feel comfortable. So just, I think really being present and being available to people is the first thing I would say.
We're not always good at having an ongoing conversation and making something open instead of saying, well, we talked about that once 3 weeks ago. Boy, I don't want to bring it up again. It was too awkward. Yeah. Just saying, the door's open. Yeah. Yeah.
The door's open, and I'm going to remind you that the door's open. Because you think about it with grief as an example, like when somebody experiences a loss, there's this huge outpouring of support, and then it peters off. And everybody goes back to their normal life, and this person is like, but life has not gone back to normal for them. So it's like, don't just send your condolences once. Send your condolences, right away, a week later, a month later, 2 months later. That kind of thing, I think, to just do essentially what we would call in our field outreach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the other thing I think that's important is understand that we cope differently. And as you said about the training that you experienced, that some people will work through this by talking and some people will work through this by exercising or something else entirely. And as long as it's a coping mechanism that isn't causing problems, that it's okay for people to work at this at their own pace and in their own way.
It is interesting how the more that we understand each other and know the way that people cope, the way we can sort of support each other too. I have a colleague of mine a few years ago experienced it was a pretty sudden traumatic incident to his family, and he was taking some time off, and everybody was kind of circle the wagons and whatever, and on one of these days off that he had, which was unusual for him, as we're working, we're in the same industry, right? Days off aren't always common. He went up and started installing track lights in the attic that he'd been meaning to do forever, because that's how he deals with stress and grief and trauma. And as he was doing that, feeling okay, he thought, I wonder where my wife and kids are. Because he kind of realized, oh wait, they do this differently. And so I've been working on this for a while. Let me go over here and kind of hug and sit and hug. And so to meet their needs as well as his need. And but he knew that. And so when you have that insight, it can really help. It just, I guess, kind of goes back to, like you're saying, is getting to know, people, but also getting to know culture. Mm-hmm. To know where people are coming from in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that actually having that experience when I was working in Kenya, and one of the colleagues who was European, her husband passed away rather suddenly, and very, very difficult time for her. And it was really hard for the colleagues who I worked with who were Kenyan to understand what she would have wanted and needed in terms of support. That in Europe, the way of dealing with grief is a little bit different. And so it took a lot to try to convince them that she wouldn't probably want to come to a public forum to talk about that, which would be totally normative. And I would say if one of them went through, that is absolutely what needed to happen. And that a European or North American's discomfort with that would need to be put aside. Like you got to show up, because that's how this person is going to grieve.
Well, in that collectivistic, sometimes even the rural cultures where we're all in this together, we all stop working to come together and sit and talk and sing and whatever we do. But to try to help them. And so that's interesting that you bring that up, where in this case you're actually talking about where a professional's needs were important enough to bring up. And get that across to those that were there's that line between the helper and the helped sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we're afraid to cross that line and admit that we have needs also. Mm-hmm. To say, oh, well, I guess I better just to explain, no, actually that's not going to be helpful for her. Let me educate you guys on her culture a little bit.
Yeah. And it's that it is in the humanitarian sector also a two-way street, or a multiple way street, because you've got so many cultures interacting in the same space. Yeah.
What do you think are some of the biggest obstacles to developing resiliency and overcoming the effects of trauma?
One of the things I think that is an obstacle is just implementation, right? And I was thinking about this recently, listening to some aid workers who were talking about their experiences and the real struggles that they were having, and then talking about the organization didn't support us. And then they named like 3 or 4 things that activities they were suggested to do, and kind of scoffed at them. And I thought, well, it's really interesting because you didn't like the support that you got, but you did actually get something. And I remember this from doing DBT as well, that I think sometimes people's perception of what will help, when you're really suffering, when you're in immense pain, it's almost inconceivable to some people that, going for a walk could help, or that it feels like it needs, my pain is this big, so the solution has to be at least that big. And the reality is, as you know, there's no magic here. There's no strategy that I can say, well, just do this and it will make it all go away. It is, for me, it's the equivalent of taking care of your physical health. If you want to be fit and healthy, you have to eat well and exercise. And everybody understands that concept. And you don't have to like exercising, but you still have to do it.
And doing a little bit that's healthy on an ongoing basis is the bigger solution, rather than I'll run 10 miles once in my life.
Exactly. And so I think people often have a hard time building resilience because their idea of what that should look like is not what it really looks like. And then so when you suggest it to them, they're like, that's it? This is not helpful. Yeah. So for me, it's exactly as you said, it's time multiplied by effort equals result, right? For pretty much anything in your life, but particularly for mental health and physical health. And so one of the struggles that I see is, how do you help people to build habits, right? Resilience is a habit, and I truly believe that it's a habit that I've built. I'm not an innately resilient person, but how do you convince people, or how do you help people to just try those small things every day?
And can be difficult, especially if you're instituting that on an organizational level, because you're dealing with multiple personalities, and not multiple personalities, but different people is what I mean.
Yes.
And trying to get that to happen. It's kind of like, as you're talking about, like the taking the walk. Is taking a walk going to cure my depression? No. So I have to accept that, but I also have to accept that taking a walk consistently may actually help a lot more than I think it will. So on the one hand, I have to get rid of the magic miracle cure thinking.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, I have to embrace the thing that is magical and miraculous about the very, very simple.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way of putting it.
It kind of goes back to what you said too about just being there for people. I think one of the things where I see people get super controlling and resentful, even when they are trying to help a loved one or a colleague through something like this, is when we try to overstep our bounds and we try to get pushy about it and push someone into, you need to go to therapy for this, or you need to do this, or you need to do that, instead of just being there. And one of the reasons I think is that we undervalue how powerful listening really is.
Yeah.
And just being there. It's that simple thing. It's not a magic cure, but it is that simple thing. It's
feeling really heard and understood by someone else, I think, is an incredibly powerful experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like to talk about it as if, when we receive that as a gift, it's like we receive this wonderful, our dream gift wrapped in gold wrapping paper. But then when we give the gift, we think to ourselves like we're saying, oh, hey, I found this tuna fish sandwich in the parking lot. Do you want it? And trying to say, wait, when I give it, it's the same thing as when I receive it, that just being there and being present.
Yeah. But it's funny that you say that about the tuna fish sandwich, because I sometimes have found that experience. One of the things I've had to work on for myself is just getting more comfortable with, this is what resilience building looks like. Because when I talk to people about it and they're really in distress, you can kind of sometimes see them getting deflated as they realize that I don't have a magic cure. And I've had to work on the fact that it does work. It really does work. And I believe in it, and it is just helping people to think that is a worthwhile effort to put in.
There's a big element of that in any kind of psychological services, I think, is that confidence of being able to say, no, really, this is valuable. Because we run into that all the time where people say, oh, well, I'm good at talking to people. And it's like, yeah, but there's a little more that we do. Yeah. It's not just talking to people. Oh, well, okay. Well, if I put a camera in your office and watch what you did, it would look like, talking to people. So, so there's that element sometimes where we're filled with that doubt and things.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you, because another thing that anyone who listens to this show knows is that I have a sort of mischievous attitude when it comes to kind of buzzwords and trends in the field. I had a boss years ago who he loved to point out how many books start with cognitive behavioral therapy 4, and then it would have anything, bipolar, addiction, whatever, and he'd say, they're the same book. They're all the same book, but they just have the last word changed. Yeah. Evidence-based practice is another one that we throw around all the time without always knowing what it means. Self-esteem, if you want to go old school, is another one that sometimes we don't define. So one of the trends that I think I've seen a lot of is trauma-informed care. And I wanted to, I'm sure you're aware of this and it must be of interest to you. What do you think of all this emphasis on trauma-informed care in mental health and addictions and things like that?
I mean, overall, I think it's positive in the sense that I was saying this to you just before we started recording. I do a lot of training with people who interview asylum seekers and refugees. And I guess I could call that trauma-informed approaches to interviewing. I don't, but maybe I'll start.
There's a book title in there somewhere. I'm just saying.
Yes, yeah. So to me, yes, I want people to understand, people who are doing this kind of work, to really understand the impact that trauma can have on someone's ability to communicate and to recall their experiences. But I guess I would think that it's just, maybe I just want people to understand how people function, not necessarily, it's like people-informed interviewing, because it's more than simply trauma. I do think also that there has been, and this may not make me popular with my mental health colleagues, but awesome. We're in the sort of climax of trauma focus, right? It's like we went from some years ago, too bad something happened to you, suck it up, to like, you must be debilitated by this experience that happened to you. And I think we've almost pathologized people's very normal reactions. And to go back to even to your question about how, what should someone do with a loved one? One of the other things is, don't pathologize normal grieving and normal reactions. Not everybody needs to see a mental health professional. So I think sometimes I worry that we're a little bit over-focused on these things. And there's a balance there of not discounting the people who are truly in need and truly suffering, but also not sending consistently this message to people that you cannot cope. Yeah. It's like impossible to cope with this. You will definitely be messed up now.
I think whenever we start pre-packaging things, and it kind of goes along with when we come up with a name for it. When we say trauma-informed care, I'm with you. One of the things that I'm hesitant about in using things like that is because you kind of lose the personalization sometimes. I mean, I see that with DBT, for example. There's manuals on DBT and books on it. And sometimes people value that over the human to human interaction that happens, which is actually why DBT works when it works, is because there's those curative factors of person to person relationship. Hey, it's funny as you say that. It just popped, this memory popped in my head of, years ago, I had a client who, was working on some stuff. She had been through some addiction treatment though. And this was years later. We were working on something different. But she was telling me that in order to get out of her residential, substance abuse facility, they wouldn't let her process past a certain step in the 12-step process. The whole group would shout her down every time she talked about, oh, here's what my experience was like. And they were like, oh no, you're full of crap. You're not being honest. You're not being honest. And, so she started listening to what they were sharing. And she said, well, I was sharing everything I could think to share, but I noticed that a lot of the women were talking about how they had to trade sex for drugs at some point in their using. I'd never done that, but I decided to just tell the same thing I told and say, oh, and I had to, have sex with somebody to get drugs once. And they were like, oh, thank goodness you're finally being honest. And they let her, and gold star, and you get to move on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so I just you're saying pathologizing normality and just saying like, oh, admitting people have a different experience and moving on.
Yeah.
and allowing them to move on and things like that.
I have said this before also in training, is like there's, I don't know, 7 billion people on the planet. To assume that your understanding of the world is anywhere near to complete is like the height of arrogance, right? Like you see a tiny sliver of what the way people live and think and experience things. And, you just have to assume that there's a great amount of diversity out there in people's lived experiences.
And it goes back to that confidence you just brought up a little while ago, which is to say, oh, what I have to offer something that helps. I don't need to know everything. I don't need to say, oh, well, you must be experiencing more trauma than you're admitting.
Yes.
I don't have to put everyone in that box to be trauma informed. I just have to watch for and look for how trauma might play a role in this person who's in front of me.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think even to tie it back to what we were talking about at the beginning around the different culturally normative ways of responding, that's one of the things that I have also sort of built my confidence in, is understanding that, yes, we need an array of responses, and not to assume that therapy is the only way that we can help people. And it's also true that that's what I'm trained in, and that's what I bring to the table. So I really fully support exploring those other things, but I also am comfortable saying that it shouldn't be me who's doing that, right? That needs to come from someone else.
So tell us about your website.
So my website is a accumulation of many years of thinking about these things, and kind of came out of working in staff welfare and recognizing that I could not be in as many places as I wanted to. And I was thinking for a while about it a few years ago, I guess, thinking, oh, I should put together a manual to help people. And then I did an online course in mindfulness, and it was like the light bulb went off. Oh yeah, that's a good way to reach a lot of people.
Online
put
exists.
something online. There's this thing called the internet. You should look into it.
I think it's catching on.
Yeah, it seems to be popular.
It was good you waited, though, to make sure it wasn't just a phase.
Yeah. Well, it could have been a passing phase. So so then I started thinking about what could I do, and it's kind of grown a lot. My initial thought was, let me just put a resilience building course on here, or a stress management course. And as I started to think about it, I often say I'm plagued with ideas. Like the minute I think about one thing, I'm like, oh, and I could do this. And the response to it has been really positive from people in the field saying, oh, can you write something on this? And can you have something on, anger management and suicide risk in humanitarians and all of those things? So what it is, it's relatively new, but what it is a resource for people working in the humanitarian and aid sector to provide them with really practical, usable strategies to manage the stress of that work and of that lifestyle, right? Of the moving around, the working cross-culturally, the living in conflict zones.
So the things that are inherently traumatic might be a bit of a word, but inherently difficult about that lifestyle.
Yeah. And, also for people who have families and who are moving their kids from place to place, that's down the road. I want to have some resources for children on there. How do you cope with moving every 2 years? And
complete culture change and
and
what to do with all that money. That's the other thing, because it's, such an industry of booming money available. No. The opposite. Anyway.
The great wealth that you're accumulating. How are you going to spend it? But just how do you thrive in this industry? And I believe that people can, and I've met people who are, but I've also met a lot of great people who are either suffering or who have left because they couldn't continue. It was at too high of a cost. And so, my interest is there's a growing number, I think, of people who are working at this and really recognizing that online you can do quite a bit. And giving people something that's, the other thing for me that's important is it has to be practical and implementable. Is that a word?
It is now.
Easy to implement. For somebody who is in a very, remote area where they don't have a lot of access, or as it often happens for humanitarians, they're in a secure compound. They cannot go out, right? So
there's a limit to that, right? Just even safety. Yeah.
And then so your first choice of recreation your first 5 choices of recreation are probably not available to you. So what do you do?
And whatever is available, you've done maybe a time or two by the time you've lived there for a little while.
Yeah.
Well, great. And it's a great service, and it's a great site. As I've been on it, I encourage everybody to check it out. And give us the address again.
It is www.resilio.net, and that's RESILEO, which comes from the Latin for resilience.
Thank you for listening to the Courtemp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Courtemp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.